Diplomacy in the West in general, and in America in particular, has reached such a low that it almost appears that we're on some sort of self-destructive path. We are our own worst enemies here, and we are making things much more complicated for ourselves. And in some cases, we are outright harming our own interests. Now, there's a lot of examples I could cite. Unfortunately, there's a lot to choose from, but we're going to pick up on the U.S.'s and the Western role in the war in Ukraine, how it started and what we've done since and where we're going next. I want to take a look at those things to show you that we could be doing ourselves so much more good if we would just acknowledge reality and take rational, cogent, logical positions that work for our good and not for our harm. Now, in the lead up to war in Russia, in the latter part of 2021, Russia started building up a lot of forces on the border with Ukraine, and many people thought that there was going to be a war. Now, about a year earlier than that, Russia had done a similar things, and there was concerns at that point, and then the troops ended up dissipating for a while, and then several months later went back. Many people in 2021 thought, well, maybe that same thing's going to happen again here. He's just posturing. Putin's just posturing, even though he'd been saying since 2008 that Ukraine and NATO was a red line that he would not contemplate. And towards the end of 2021, he was starting to use, Putin was, language that said that he will use military technical means to correct the situation if NATO would not say that Ukraine was off the table for Russia. But he didn't do that. Now, to kind of set the stage here, let's take a look at what happened there at the beginning. So Stoltenberg was on a press conference once with Zelensky where they were talking about, even though from 2008 in the Bucharest conference, in the NATO conference, NATO had said Ukraine will come in. And of course, that was a red line for Russia. But in 2021, Stoltenberg addressed the current situation.
NATO has an open door policy, and this is enshrined in the NATO's founding treaty, Article 10 of the Washington Treaty, stating clearly that NATO can invite other European countries to join the alliance. And I was actually present at the NATO summit in Bucharest in 2008 when all allies agreed that Ukraine will become a member of NATO. And we stand by that decision and decisions taken after the Bucharest summit on the issue of Ukraine's possibility to become a NATO member. The message today to Russia is that it is for Ukraine as a sovereign nation to decide its own path, and for the 30 NATO allies to decide when Ukraine is ready to become a member.
Now, on the surface of it, there's some of that stuff sounds reasonable. Nobody can tell NATO whether they're going to expand or not. That's between NATO and whatever country wants to come in. And as far as it goes, that's true. So he laid out his position there, the position of the West and certainly the United States, which obviously is the driver behind NATO. And so they made their position clear. Putin, on the other hand, around the same time, actually just days later, made his own position very clear.
As for guarantees and what depends on what, and will anything depend on the negotiations, our actions will depend not on the negotiations, but on the unconditional security of Russia, today and in the future. In this regard, we have made it absolutely clear that NATO's expansion to the east is unacceptable. What's not clear about it? We are not the ones that deploy missiles next to the United States borders. That's the other way around. The United States brought their missiles next to our borders. They are at our threshold. Are we excessive in our demands not to put any more offensive weapons next to our home? What's so unusual about this request? So NATO is expanding. And so now they're in Poland. So they have the offensive weapons in there. That's what I'm talking about. We are not the ones who are threatening someone. We are not the ones who came to the border of the US or the UK. They came to us. And now they're saying, no, now we will have Ukraine as well. It means they will deploy their weapons there. Or then you start to expand NATO to the east. But we ask you not to do it, and you promised us that you won't do it. And then you told, show us the paper where it says, we don't care about your concerns. And that happened every year. Every year we try to talk back, we try to stop this expansion, we were expressing our concerns. No, nothing. Go to hell with your concerns. We will do whatever we deem fit. 5 waves of expansion. So what's this misunderstanding is about? Ask them why can't they understand us. We want to ensure our security.
Now, it's really important here, and that's a little bit of a long clip, but I wanted you to see several components of that are really important. In diplomacy, it is necessary to understand your adversary's position. You don't have to agree with it. You don't even have to like it, but you do have to know what it is. And as I was watching this at the time that it happened, it was very clear to me that Putin was showing his exasperation. There had been 5 rounds of NATO expansion. Russia had been saying from the outset they were opposed to it, and every time NATO did it anyway, they weren't concerned about the outcome. Russia, made a lot of noise, but at the end of the day, didn't do anything. So NATO came to believe, well, you can continue to do this. But what Putin was saying in this press conference right before Christmas of 2021 was that he had had enough. You could tell that his exasperation was high, his frustration was high, and he emphatically said, we will take action based on our security. Now, I could tell at that time that this large buildup of forces wasn't just large numbers, but it was the type of forces that were there. There was mechanized forces, there was artillery forces, there was medical detachments, logistics, trucks, everything that you actually need to conduct an offensive. Because I had done that. I had actually been part of a large-scale armored mechanized warfare in Desert Storm in 1991. So I knew what had happened. So I knew this was different than the one before and some of the others, that he was actually putting the pieces in place to launch a war. And now the following, about a couple of weeks later, actually from Putin's comments there, I was asked on Fox News in early January of 2022 what I thought of the prospects for war and if there was anything we could do maybe to stop it.
We have to look at this in stone cold reality. And the reality is, as your correspondent just mentioned, in 2008, when Putin was afraid that Georgia was going to join NATO, he took military action, limited military action, and did the same thing in 2014 with Crimea. There is no reason for us to think that if he doesn't feel pushed and threatened again, that he might take the same action. What would be a much better policy for the United States, although one that many don't like, but the one that has the best chance of success is in Zelensky's call with Biden tomorrow. He should encourage him to declare neutrality so that he won't go with Putin, he won't go with us. But what that will do is that will lower the reason, any justification Putin may have to do that, but it will also put a buffer between Russia and the NATO countries.
All you have to do is acknowledge reality. Look, in diplomacy, it should be a self-evident, like any negotiation, business negotiation, negotiations in your family sometimes, nobody gets everything. So you want to try to get the things that are the most important to you, but you got to understand to get an agreement, the other side's got to get something that it wants too. We don't want to do that. We don't want to know what they think. We don't want to know what's important to them. We just want to have our aspirations, and then that's it. We just want to be able to do it. So we don't pay attention to what Putin had been saying. We don't pay attention to what's going on the ground. We just say, no, we want to do the things our way. Now, about a month after that, and as it turned out, it was 5 days before the war, I wrote an article in the publication 1945, the National Security publication, called How to Avoid a War with Russia, Declare Ukraine Can't Join NATO. In that article, Zelensky had been saying that he was frustrated with NATO because he had been asking to come in. He had wanted some guarantees. He had wanted some dates. He wanted a clear enunciation. And he finally just said, if it's yes, say yes. If it's no, say no, but tell us something. And in the article, I wrote, that answer is clearly no. Every NATO country has been unambiguous about its declaration that it will not send one soldier to fight for Zelensky's Ukraine. Repeated again by U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris in Munich on Saturday. Yet alliance leaders have been unwilling to state the obvious. NATO not only won't fight for Ukraine today, they will never fight Russia over Ukraine. That position is sound, logical, and appropriate for the 30-member bloc, but its unwillingness to acknowledge the truth could have deadly and unnecessary consequences. Now, of course, we know how that worked out. There were, in fact, unnecessary consequences that would follow that. But for a brief moment, it actually looked like Zelensky's frustration and NATO's unwillingness to openly declare they would might be able to avert war. On the 14th of February, just 10 days before the war would start, the Ukrainian ambassador to the UK made some very public comments that started to sound like they're going to maybe back off of the NATO declaration.
We have to do, because we are not a member of family, we can't expect that somebody will come to save us. We are flexible enough to look for other arrangements, like bilateral. For example, what we have with, we're trying to build with Britain, Poland.
Bilateral relationships. Keep that in mind, because that's going to come into play in a little bit. But on that same day, also Zelensky himself seemed to be walking back his aspirations, maybe sometime in the distant future.
Що членством в НАТО ми б хотіли, і так це було б забезпечення нашої безпеки, нашої територіальної цілісності. І також це закріплено і в законодавстві України, в Конституції України. Скільки Україна повинна йти по цьому шляху, з ким вона буде йти, хто буде друзями, партнерами і буде підтримувати нашу державу на цьому шляху. А може дійсно питання відкритих дверей – це для нас така історія, начебто як мрія, такий сигнал, куди ми йдемо, а коли там будемо, ніхто не знає, не тільки Україна, а навіть деякі члени НАТО.
So he was saying, maybe aspirations of NATO is just like a dream, like it would be really cool if this happened, but maybe it won't. Now, if we had stuck with that, if we had followed that up, and if NATO had said, yeah, it's probably a distant aspiration, probably nothing's going to happen for a long time, that might have been one thing. But unfortunately, NATO continued through some of their senior officials and even some American officials to say, no, Ukraine is going to come in NATO. We're going to stick with that, the Bucharest summit, where they said where we said they could come in. We're going to stick with that. They're going to continue to do that. And as a result, Putin finally ran out of his patience. And on the 24th of February of 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. On that day, Stoltenberg then went very somberly before the global public to announce what he had tried to do to stop it.
Sadly, what we have warned against for months has come to pass. Despite all calls on Russia to change course and tireless efforts to seek a diplomatic solution, peace on our continent has been shattered.
So, according to Stoltenberg, on that day, they had done tireless operations to try diplomacy. They had tried to avoid a war and prevent the invasion from happening in the first place. And now then it's Russia's fault. They had come in and invaded. Now, look, it is true that it was Russia's fault. They invaded. No two ways about it. Nobody forced Putin to do this. There were alternatives he could have done even in that situation, but that's the path that he chose. But it is wrong, and it is inaccurate to suggest that it came out of nowhere or that it was just this unprovoked aggression, which was the common phrase used at the time, because Putin had been very clear, emphatically, over an extended period of time, and especially in the months leading up to this moment, that NATO in Ukraine was going to equal military action. We know for sure that Stoltenberg was aware of this, because just a couple of months ago, Stoltenberg, I think, inadvertently admitted that he knew how to diplomatically avoid war and chose not to take it.
Putin declared in the autumn of 2021, and he actually sent a draft treaty that he wanted NATO to sign to promise no more NATO enlargement. That was what he sent us. And that was a precondition for not invade Ukraine. Of course, we didn't sign that.
It's self-evident in what he's saying that Putin, all the things that he said that Putin told him in that private negotiation, that's what Putin said openly. And that's that clip I just showed you a minute ago. He emphatically said NATO in Ukraine is going to equal military action. So nobody could have been surprised by that. And as I pointed out in that article that was written in February, look, NATO is never going to let Ukraine into it. They're going to give them weapons. They're going to give them moral support. They will never let Ukraine in for the obvious reasons that it's so much instability and there's such an angst and a difficulty between the two that whether now or later on, if those two came to blows, that it would suck the entire alliance into a war that nobody wants to fight. So it's self-evident that we're not going to allow them in there. Why would we not stop and use diplomacy and just acknowledge reality and say openly what we all know to be true? NATO is never going to invite Ukraine to be a member of it. Now, there's plenty of other things they could have done. They could have, as was said, they could have had bilateral negotiations. As the UK ambassador, the Ukrainian ambassador to the UK said, we'll have bilateral kinds of communications and deals. There's plenty of that was open. Putin was open to that. He was amenable to that. But no one would do it. Instead, we took the aspiration. We don't want Russia telling us what we can and can't do, even though we're really not going to do it, and we know it. And so we're gonna staunchly sit there. We're gonna puff our chest out, and we're gonna be tough. And who's paid the price for that? The people of Ukraine. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians are dead. A fifth of their territory is gone. Scores of their cities have been laid to waste because we would not engage in diplomacy. Now that it's to our own harm and hugely to the harm of Ukraine. Those are the facts. Unfortunately, that was not the end of the failure of diplomacy, even in this war right here. About a month into the war, it became obvious that even though Russia had made some huge missteps and were not anywhere near as capable militarily as many people thought, as I thought that they were at the beginning, it was equally clear that still they were big enough to absorb those mistakes and that they still had the balance of power was in their favor and that over time it was going to work in Russia's favor. They were going to end up winning the war, no matter how things went in the middle term. People started to recognize that, and there was a move again with both Zelensky and some of his senior officials that they recognized maybe we need to make a deal to get through with this. Turkey agreed to help out and was holding negotiations in Istanbul in late March when we got this report.
But the mood after this round appeared cautiously optimistic.
The most significant progress since the beginning of the talks was made today.
The Ukrainian delegation said it is prepared to accept neutral status and not to host foreign military within its borders. This prompted a promising response from the Russian side.
So when they came out of that agreement, both sides, and I was tracking this very carefully at the time, both sides, both delegations came out and basically said, if Ukraine agrees to neutrality, if they agree there's not going to be any Ukraine in NATO, then Russia would say we would stop the war, and we would even put off the discussions on what's going to happen with the Donbass, and even not put Crimea completely out of the picture and say that they would just defer that for 15 years, and then that would be addressed later on. That was not ideal, but it was amazing, remarkable considering where they were at the time. And instead of pursuing that diplomatically, it appears that one Western leader shot it down.
A foreign affairs analysis by Fiona Hill and Angela Stent has given rise to quite a scandal in the world of geopolitics. Titled "The World Putin Wants," the foreign affairs article dropped a bombshell as it said this, and I quote, "According to multiple former senior US officials we spoke with, in April 2022, Russian and Ukrainian negotiators appeared to have tentatively agreed on the outlines of a negotiated interim settlement. According to the tentative peace plan, Russia would withdraw to its position on February 23rd when it controlled part of the Donbass region and all of Crimea, and in exchange, Ukraine would promise not to seek NATO membership and instead receive security guarantees from a number of countries. Now, why did this plan turn dead on arrival? According to Ukrainian publication Ukrainska Pravda, following the arrival of British Prime Minister Boris Johnson in Kyiv in April, a possible meeting between Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Russian President Vladimir Putin was put off. According to the publication, which has sources close to Zelensky, Boris Johnson carried to Ukraine two messages from the West. First, Putin is a war criminal and he should be pressured. not negotiated with. Second, and most importantly, even if Ukraine is ready to sign some agreements on guarantees with Putin, they, as in the West, are not.
That is just mind-boggling when you think about the ramifications of this. With basic diplomacy recognizing reality, the war between Russia and Ukraine could have been averted. It didn't need to happen at all. 1 month into the war, at this point, Ukraine still had possession of Mariupol. The war could have come to an end then. Kiev would still have been nominally in charge of all of Ukraine, with the possibility of Crimea being reinserted back later. But even in the Donbass, there would have been nominally in charge of that. But the killing would have stopped. The destruction would have stopped. And instead, we said, no, our aspiration is to hurt Russia and to get everything back to the 1991 borders. That's what they would prefer. So instead of acknowledging reality, they chose to ignore that. Now, things got worse right after that, because then Zelensky's, after this fiasco happened in Istanbul, Zelensky said, all right, I'm not even interested in talking now. And then he got really hardcore and said, no, I want actually everything back to 1991. I won't settle for any of that here. And then Putin said, okay, fine, then we're definitely done. We're not even talking. That condition has permeated even through this day right here. Now, unfortunately for the people of Ukraine, this is going to sound counterintuitive, but work with me here. They had some pretty significant tactical successes in the fall of 2022, where they recaptured this huge swath of area in the north of the country around Kharkiv. And then when they forced Russia out of the part of the Kherson Oblast and out of Kherson City in October and November of that year. So now then, Ukraine thinks now we can win. So now they want to go on this big offensive, and they start getting the West to give them thousands of armored vehicles, thousands of other kinds of vehicles, tanks, artillery pieces, infantry carriers, millions of rounds of artillery shells, all kinds of training, intelligence, all this with the promise, according to Zelensky, that they're going to recover all this territory in a spring and summer offensive of this year, which now was a complete and utter debacle. Now, again, we get back to the same theme here that seems to undermine so much of our diplomacy, as our unwillingness to look at reality. Now, as I've talked about in several of these deep dives in the past, and I had written about earlier this year, prior to this operation, the offensive, there was no prospect that Ukraine was going to win. There was very practical, fundamental military reasons, economic reasons, human capital reasons why Russia was not going to lose and Ukraine was not going to succeed in their offensive. And that's exactly the way it came out. And now then, Ukraine has basically burned up everything that we gave them over the previous year. And now then they're not merely at a stalemate. Now then they're at a disadvantage. Russia, on the other hand, now they're saying, we're not even interested in talking. Now Putin's not even talking about having a negotiated settlement, because in his mind, they have passed a tipping point. And now that with the failure of this offensive and the clear propensity in the West that we're not going to fund anywhere close to the level that we did last year, which didn't result in any territorial changes, now they're going to get even less, if they get that at all. Because there's been a number of countries who have now balked on giving them anything. The United States may give them some money in next year, but they may not, because the U.S. Congress hasn't agreed to do that. Every way you want to look at it, Ukraine is getting weaker and weaker. They continue to lose extraordinary numbers of people. Now then, they're press ganging into service people who are old. Some kids have been put into service and have been captured by the Russians. They're now going to start mobilizing women. I mean, literally, they're scraping the bottom of the barrel here, and they're just getting everybody. You're not going to get a quality force when that happens. If we had the least amount of wisdom and we're willing to negotiate and use diplomacy, we could probably bring this to an end. Now, as I've also been saying, the longer it goes to get to this point, the greater the cost is to Ukraine, both in personnel, in cities destroyed, and in territory lost. The deal that they could have had in Istanbul in 2022, in March of 2022, April, is going to be right now like a fantasy. It's 100%, 100 times better than anything they're probably going to end up with, because this will definitely end in a negotiated settlement at some point. But right now, Both the Putin and the Russian Duma are saying, we're not even going to talk to Ukraine unless it's about terms of capitulation. That's what they're saying right now. And they're preparing military forces to continue on. The longer it takes to do that, the greater the cost is going to be for Ukraine. But the end is ordained. Until we get to the point as a nation, as the West, as the United States, that we can't get everything that we want. Just because we desire an outcome doesn't mean we're going to get it. If we're not willing to listen to what the adversary thinks, what's important to him, what he's afraid of, and put that into our calculations based on the reality on the ground, we are going to continue to undermine our own interests. And we need to get this war shut off quickly so that it doesn't expand. And we got a similar set of circumstances going on in the Middle East. We'll talk about that on a future deep dive with Israel and the Hamas, Iran, the Houthi rebels, our troops in Iraq and Syria. All of these things are huge messes because we would not accede to reality and make rational decisions when we had a chance to do it in order. We haven't done that. We've got another potential time bomb waiting for us in the Pacific between China and Taiwan, and how we're going to relate to that. We're going to have more opportunity to do the right thing or to do the dumb thing, which is not based on reality. We go far enough in this direction and we make enough of these errors, one of these days, it's not going to be an embarrassment or going to have some cost to it, but it could be a catastrophic loss to our country. That's the direction that we're heading, and why it is so vital and so crucial that we get this right and we get these kinds of mentalities purged right now and return normal, wise diplomacy based on reality. That is what we need to do if we want to continue to be a strong nation well into the future, with our economic security provided and our national security assured. All those things can still happen. Even with all the mistakes we've made, we're big enough to overcome some of those things as long as we stop harming ourselves and get this fixed. It's time to do that. Thank you very much for listening. We're going to continue to give you this kind of information here on a Deep Dive. We will be unintimidated. We will be uncompromised on telling you the truth, no matter how ugly it may be at sometimes, because you deserve to know. Thank you, and we will see you next time on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.